There are 47 names written in the margins of a worn Bible that sits in the historical archives of the New York Foundling Hospital. Names written in pencil, so faint now that you need special lighting to read them. Names that belong to children who boarded westbound trains between 1854 and 1929. Children who were promised new families and better lives. Children who simply disappeared into the American heartland with no record of what became of them. The woman who wrote those names was Catherine O'Brien. She was 11 years old when she started keeping her list in 1889, adding to it for the next 6 years until she herself was placed on a train heading west. By the time Catherine turned 17, she had documented 47 children who had gotten off at various stops along the railway lines and were never heard from again. No letters home, no follow-up visits, no trace. Just gone, swallowed up by farms and small towns across America, their fates unknown to the people who had sent them away. The question that haunted Catherine for the rest of her long life was simple. What happened to them? Were they loved, cared for, given the opportunities they'd been promised? Or were they exploited, abused, worked like animals, and disposed of when they were no longer useful? The answer, as Catherine would eventually discover, was far more complex and disturbing than anyone wanted to acknowledge. It was a story about good intentions twisted into something darker, about a system that treated children like commodities, about the fine line between rescue and trafficking. But in 1889, standing in the crowded dormitory of the Foundling Hospital, Catherine knew none of this yet. She only knew that her friend Mary had boarded a train 3 months ago, promised a family in Kansas, and no one had heard from her since. And Catherine had decided that someone needed to remember, someone needed to keep count. The New York Foundling Hospital opened its doors in October 1869, founded by the Sisters of Charity to care for abandoned infants and children. By 1889, when Catherine arrived, the institution was overflowing. New York City in the late 19th century was bursting with immigrants, poverty, disease, and desperation. Families who couldn't feed their children left them on doorsteps, in churches, in alleyways. Mothers died in childbirth, leaving infants with no one to care for them. Fathers drank themselves to death or simply vanished, abandoning wives and children. The streets of Five Points, the Bowery, and the Lower East Side teemed with homeless children, some as young as 5 or 6, surviving by begging, stealing, or selling newspapers. The Foundling Hospital was meant to be a refuge, but it was overwhelmed almost from the moment it opened. By the 1880s, the building housed more than 1,200 children at any given time, 3 or 4 to a bed, sleeping in shifts, sharing bowls and spoons, wearing donated clothes that rarely fit. The sisters did their best, but there was never enough food, enough medicine, enough hands to care for so many desperate souls. Catherine had been brought to the Foundling Hospital on a January morning in 1889 by a priest who found her sleeping in the doorway of St. Patrick's Cathedral. She was 11 years old, though she looked younger, small and thin with hollowed cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. Her mother had died of consumption 3 months earlier, coughing blood into rags in a tenement room that housed 6 families. Her father had disappeared before Catherine was born. She had an older brother somewhere, but he had left when she was 8 to find work and never came back. For 3 months after her mother's death, Catherine survived on the streets. She learned quickly which shopkeepers might give her scraps, which alleys were safe to sleep in, which men to avoid. She learned to make herself small and quiet, to disappear into shadows, to run when necessary. She learned that the world had no interest in a small Irish girl with no family and no money, that she could die on the street and no one would notice or care. The priest who found her saved her life, though Catherine didn't see it that way at first. The Foundling Hospital was warm and dry, and there was food every day, but it was also loud and crowded and frightening. Children cried constantly. Babies died regularly, their small bodies carried away in the night. The older children fought over everything: food, blankets, space, anything that might make their existence slightly more bearable. Catherine learned to navigate this world, too. She made herself useful to the sisters, helping with the younger children, fetching water, scrubbing floors. She learned to read from Sister Margaret, who held lessons in the early mornings for children who showed interest. And she made friends, or something like friends, with the other girls in her dormitory. That's how she met Mary Sullivan. Mary was 13, 2 years older than Catherine, with red hair and freckles and a laugh that could light up the grimmest day. She had been at the Foundling Hospital for 2 years, brought in after her parents died in a tenement fire. Mary was kind to Catherine from the start, showing her where to find extra blankets, how to avoid the meanest of the older boys, which sisters were gentle and which were harsh. They became inseparable. They slept in adjacent beds, worked together in the laundry, whispered stories to each other in the dark about the lives they'd had before and the lives they might have someday. Mary talked about wanting a family again, a real family with parents who loved her and a house with her own room and 3 meals a day and maybe even a dog. When Sister Agnes announced that Mary had been selected for the Orphan Train program, Mary was ecstatic. She grabbed Catherine's hands and spun her around the dormitory, laughing. "I'm going to have a family, Catherine. A real family. They're sending me to Kansas, to farmers who want a daughter." Catherine tried to be happy for her friend, but something felt wrong. The Orphan Train program had been operating for decades by then. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, had been sending children west since 1854, and the Foundling Hospital had joined the effort in the 1870s. The idea was simple. New York had too many orphans, and the Western Territories needed workers. Farmers, shopkeepers, and families across the Midwest and West were willing to take children, give them homes, raise them as their own. It sounded wonderful on paper. In practice, Catherine had noticed something troubling. Children left on the trains all the time, groups of 20 or 30 at a time, dressed in donated clothes and carrying small bags with their few possessions. They were told to write letters back to the hospital to let the sisters know how they were faring. Some did write cheerful letters about their new families, their new homes, their new lives. But many didn't. And some children, like Mary, simply vanished. No letters, no updates, no word at all. Catherine asked Sister Margaret about it once. What happens to the children who don't write back? Sister Margaret's expression had gone carefully neutral. They're busy with their new lives, child. They have chores and school and families to care for. They don't always have time to write. But Catherine had seen the doubt in Sister Margaret's eyes, the way her hands tightened on her rosary beads. The sister knew something she wasn't saying. Mary left on a Thursday morning in April 1889. Catherine helped her pack her small bag, a change of clothes, a handkerchief, a small wooden cross that had belonged to Mary's mother. They hugged on the steps of the hospital, and Mary promised to write as soon as she arrived in Kansas, promised to tell Catherine everything about her new family. "I'll come back for you," Mary whispered. "When I'm older, when I have money, I'll come back and we'll be sisters for real." Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched Mary climb into the wagon with 15 other children, all of them clutching their bags, all of them looking scared and excited and hopeful. The wagon pulled away, and Catherine stood on the steps until it disappeared around the corner. 3 months passed. No letter came. Catherine asked Sister Agnes about it every week. "Has Mary written? Have you heard from Kansas?" Sister Agnes always had the same answer. "Not yet, child. Give her time." But Catherine's unease grew. She started paying attention to the other children who left on the trains, started asking questions. How many came back to visit? How many wrote letters? How many simply vanished? She began keeping a list in the only place she had, the margins of the small Bible Sister Margaret had given her for learning to read. She wrote Mary's name first, along with the date she left and her destination. Mary Sullivan, April 18th, 1889, Kansas. Then she started adding others, children she remembered leaving in the months before, children who had never sent word back. The list grew. By June, she had written 14 names. By September, 23. By the end of 1889, 31 names filled the margins of her Bible, each one a child who had disappeared into America's vast interior with no trace. Catherine became obsessed. She listened to conversations between the sisters, trying to glean information. She talked to children who returned from failed placements, asking them what they had seen at the various stops along the train routes. Slowly, a picture emerged that made Catherine's blood run cold. The orphan trains operated like mobile auctions. At each stop, the children would be lined up on a platform, sometimes in front of the train station, sometimes in a town hall or church. Local families would come to inspect them, looking them over like livestock at a market. They checked teeth, felt muscles, asked questions about health and strength and willingness to work. Some families wanted daughters to help with housework and cooking. Others wanted sons to work in fields or shops. The youngest and prettiest children were chosen first. The older ones, the sickly ones, the ones who looked too independent or too broken, they were often left behind to continue on to the next stop. But even being chosen didn't guarantee safety. Catherine heard stories from children who had been returned to New York after months or years in the West. Stories about families who worked them 16 hours a day, fed them scraps, beat them for the smallest infractions. Stories about children who were passed from family to family like unwanted furniture, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. Stories about girls who disappeared into brothels, boys who were sold to mining operations, children who simply vanished and were never mentioned again. One boy, Tommy, who had been returned after 3 years in Iowa, told Catherine something that haunted her. The family that took me, they had 5 kids of their own. They wanted me to work the farm, dawn to dark, harder than any of their own children. When I got sick with fever, they put me in the barn and told me to get better or they'd send me back. I got better, but I ran away. Walked for 3 days to get to a town with a train station. Begged for money to get back to New York. I was one of the lucky ones. There were other kids on that farm, kids from earlier trains. I never saw them again after they got too sick or too hurt to work. The farmer said they'd been sent on to other families, but he shook his head. I don't think that's what happened. Catherine wrote Tommy's story down, not in her Bible, but in a journal she had started keeping, hidden under her mattress. She documented every story she heard, every detail about the train system, every piece of information she could gather. By 1891, when Catherine was 13, her Bible contained 43 names. That was the year Sister Agnes called her into the office and told her she had been selected for a placement. "There's a family in Nebraska," Sister Agnes said, her voice gentle. "The Hendersons. They're looking for a girl your age to help with their younger children and with housework. It's a good opportunity, Catherine. They're respectable people, God-fearing, with a proper home." Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. "I don't want to go." Sister Agnes's expression shifted, becoming stern. "This is not a choice, child. You're 13 years old. You cannot stay at the Foundling Hospital forever. We need the space for younger children. The Hendersons are offering you a home, a future. You should be grateful. What if I'm not treated well? What if something happens to me?" The Children's Aid Society checks on placements regularly. If there are problems, they will intervene. But Catherine had heard enough stories to know this was a lie. The Children's Aid Society couldn't possibly monitor thousands of children scattered across dozens of states. Once a child left New York, they were on their own. That night, Catherine made a decision. She would go to Nebraska, but she would not go silently. She would document everything, would write letters back to the hospital describing exactly what happened to the children on these trains. And she would find out what happened to Mary if it was the last thing she did. Catherine left New York on a cold morning in November 1891. She was part of a group of 32 children, ranging in age from 4 to 15. They were dressed in donated clothes that the Children's Aid Society provided for train journeys. Simple dresses for the girls, trousers and shirts for the boys, all clean, but worn all meant to make the children look respectable and appealing to potential families. The train journey west was both monotonous and terrifying. The children sat in a special car, supervised by 2 agents from the Children's Aid Society, Mr. Harlow and Miss Pritchard. They stopped at towns along the way: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska. At each stop, some children were chosen. At each stop, Catherine watched as families looked over the remaining children with calculating eyes. Catherine took notes in a small notebook she had hidden in her bag. She wrote down the names of children who were chosen, the towns they stayed in, descriptions of the families who took them. She noted which children looked happy to be chosen and which looked terrified. At the Nebraska stop, a farming couple named Henderson approached Catherine. They were in their 40s, weathered and serious. Mrs. Henderson felt Catherine's arms, checking for strength. Mr. Henderson asked if she could cook, clean, and handle children. "Yes, sir," Catherine said, keeping her voice steady. "I've been helping with the younger children at the hospital for years." They nodded and signed the papers. Just like that, Catherine belonged to them. The Henderson farm was 15 miles outside of town, accessed by a rough wagon road that cut through endless prairies. The house was a simple wooden structure, 2 stories, with a barn and several outbuildings. The Hendersons had 4 children of their own, ranging in age from 3 to 10. And they made it clear from the start that Catherine's role was to care for them, while Mrs. Henderson worked in the fields alongside her husband. Catherine's life on the farm was grueling. She woke before dawn to start fires, prepare breakfast, dress, and feed the younger children. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, washing clothes by hand, scrubbing floors, caring for the children. She worked until she collapsed into bed at night, too exhausted to think. But she kept her promise to herself. Once a month, when the Hendersons went to town for supplies, Catherine would slip away to the post office and send letters back to the Foundling Hospital. She wrote to Sister Margaret, describing her conditions in careful detail, never complaining outright. The Hendersons checked her letters, but including enough information that someone paying attention could understand. She also began investigating what happened to other orphan-trained children in the area. In town, she would ask discreet questions. Had anyone seen children from the trains? Did they know of families who had taken in orphans? What happened to those children? The picture that emerged was disturbing. Some children had found good homes with families who genuinely cared for them. But many others had been taken as free labor, worked hard, and discarded when they were no longer useful. Catherine heard stories about a boy who had frozen to death in a barn after being locked out during winter. A girl who had been sent back east after becoming pregnant at 14, the family refusing to say how it happened. Children who had run away and were never found. In the spring of 1893, Catherine heard about a woman named Mrs. Potter who lived on a farm 20 miles away. Mrs. Potter had supposedly taken in several children from the orphan trains over the years. Catherine saved money from small jobs she did in town, mending, washing, anything that earned a few cents, and eventually saved enough for a wagon ride to visit Mrs. Potter on a day when the Hendersons thought she was shopping. Mrs. Potter was an elderly widow, bent and tired, living alone in a small farmhouse. When Catherine explained why she had come, asking about the orphan-trained children, Mrs. Potter's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to take good care of them," she said, her voice shaking. "But I was too old, too poor. The children needed more than I could give. Most of them ran away within a year or two. I don't blame them. I failed them." "Do you remember their names?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Potter nodded and fetched an old ledger where she had kept records. Catherine copied the names into her notebook. 8 children who had passed through Mrs. Potter's farm between 1885 and 1890. Most had run away. One had died of pneumonia. The others, Mrs. Potter didn't know. Catherine asked the question that had been burning in her mind for 4 years. "Did you ever know a girl named Mary Sullivan? Red hair, freckles?" "She came to Kansas in 1889. Mrs. Potter shook her head slowly. "I don't recall that name, child. But I didn't know all the children who came through the trains. There were so many, scattered across so many towns." Catherine left Mrs. Potter's farm with a heavy heart and 8 more names for her Bible. She continued this pattern for 3 more years. By day, she worked on the Henderson farm, caring for children, cooking, cleaning, enduring the loneliness and exhaustion. By night and on her rare free days, she investigated, documented, and wrote letters. She added names to her Bible. Children she met in town who had come on the trains, children she heard about through gossip and stories, children who had disappeared or died or simply vanished. By 1896, when Catherine was 18, her Bible contained 47 names in the margins, written in increasingly cramped handwriting as space ran out. 47 children who had boarded trains heading west and had never been heard from again. That year, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. The Hendersons had made it clear they expected her to stay on the farm indefinitely, working without pay in exchange for room and board. But Catherine was legally an adult now. She had rights, limited as they were for a woman with no family and no money, but rights nonetheless. She saved every penny she could, took extra jobs in town, and eventually saved enough money for a train ticket back to New York. One morning in June, while the Hendersons were in the fields, Catherine packed her small bag, took her Bible and her notebooks, and walked the 15 miles to town. She bought a ticket and boarded a train heading east. She never looked back. Catherine arrived in New York City in July 1896, 7 years after she had left. The city had changed, grown even larger and more chaotic, but the Foundling Hospital was exactly as she remembered it. Sister Margaret was still there, older now and more tired, but her eyes lit up when she saw Catherine. "Child," she breathed, pulling Catherine into an embrace. "We thought you were settled in Nebraska. What are you doing here?" I came back to tell the truth, Catherine said, about what happens to the children on the trains. She showed Sister Margaret her Bible with the 47 names, showed her the notebooks filled with stories and documentation, told her everything she had learned about the orphan train system. Sister Margaret listened with growing horror, her face going pale. I knew some children struggled, she whispered, but I didn't know it was this widespread. The Children's Aid Society assured us they monitored placements, that children were safe. They can't monitor thousands of children across dozens of states, Catherine said, and they don't want to admit that their system is flawed. It's easier to pretend everything is fine, that every child finds a loving home. But that's not true. Some do, but many don't. And the ones who don't have no one to help them. Sister Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the names in Catherine's Bible. Finally, she said, "What do you want to do, child?" "I want to tell their stories. I want people to know what really happens on those trains. And I want to find out what happened to my friend Mary." Sister Margaret helped Catherine search the hospital's records. They found Mary Sullivan's file, found the name of the family in Kansas who had taken her, the Branson family. Sister Margaret wrote to the Bransons, asking for information about Mary. The response came 6 weeks later. It was brief and cold. Mary Sullivan had stayed with the Branson family for 2 years, from 1889 to 1891. She had run away in the spring of 1891 and had not been seen since. The Bransons had reported her disappearance to local authorities, but no trace of her had been found. They assumed she had either died or made her way to another town and started a new life under a different name. Catherine felt her heart break. Mary was gone, lost somewhere in the vast American interior, her fate unknown. She could be alive, could have found happiness somewhere, but more likely she had died alone and scared, another casualty of a system that treated children as disposable. Catherine spent the next 30 years trying to reform the orphan train system. She wrote articles for newspapers, gave speeches, testified before government committees. She shared the 47 names from her Bible, told the stories she had collected, demanded better oversight and protection for children being sent west. Her efforts had limited success. The orphan train program continued until 1929, moving an estimated 250,000 children from East Coast cities to homes in the Midwest and West. Many of those children did find loving families and good lives. But many others suffered, as Catherine had documented, exploited, abused, or simply lost. Catherine never found out what happened to Mary Sullivan. She searched for years, wrote letters to Kansas authorities, hired investigators when she could afford it, but Mary had vanished without a trace. In 1945, when Catherine was 67 years old and dying of cancer in a small apartment in Brooklyn, she gave her Bible and her notebooks to a young reporter from the New York Times. "Tell their stories," she whispered. "Don't let them be forgotten." The reporter published a series of articles about the orphan train system, using Catherine's documentation and interviews with survivors. The articles sparked renewed interest in the program's history, prompted investigations into what had happened to the children, and eventually led to the formation of the Orphan Train Heritage Society, an organization dedicated to helping orphan train riders find their families and document their experiences. Catherine O'Brien died on October 3, 1945. She was buried in a Catholic cemetery in Queens, her gravestone simple and small. But her Bible, with its 47 names written in fading pencil, is preserved now in the archives of the New York Foundling Hospital, a testimony to the children who were sent away with promises of better lives and were never heard from again. The Orphan Train program was created with good intentions. Charles Loring Brace genuinely believed he was saving children from poverty and death by sending them to families in the West. But good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. The program created opportunities for exploitation, failed to provide adequate oversight, and treated children as solutions to problems rather than as people with rights and needs and futures. Of the 250,000 children who rode the orphan trains, we don't know how many found loving homes and how many suffered. We don't know how many disappeared like the 47 names in Catherine's Bible. The records are incomplete, scattered, lost. Many children were placed without legal documentation, their fates unknown even to the organizations that sent them. But Catherine's Bible reminds us that each of those 250,000 children was a person. They had names, histories, hopes, fears. They were not just statistics or success stories or unfortunate casualties. They were children who deserved better than to be loaded onto trains and sent to strangers. Children who deserved protection and care and love. The names in Catherine O'Brien's Bible represent the ones we know about, the ones someone bothered to remember. How many others are there? Names that were never written down. Children who vanished without anyone noticing or caring. We'll never know the true number. We can only honor the 47 that Catherine remembered and acknowledge that they stand for countless others whose names are lost to history. Mary Sullivan, Thomas Wright, Annie O'Connor, James Kelly. The list goes on. 47 children who boarded trains heading west and were never heard from again. Someone remembered. Catherine made sure of that. And now, more than a century later, we remember too.